everyone, welcome back to Simming History, where we look at the history of architecture through the lens of The Sims. Before we get started today, if you like the video, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Today, we're taking a walk back in time to 1485 England, to the Tudor era. To the longtime watchers of this channel, you remember this build? The medieval Hull house? If you haven't seen it yet, make sure you go check it out. Tudor architecture was really just a continuation of this style of construction, but with a few key differences, all caused by a pandemic. The Black Death. Half of Europe's population had died, and the remaining half demanded higher wages, and as a result, the end of serfdom. And serfdom powered the way of living represented by the Hull House. Communal living of the Hull House was over and done. Even the poorest began to have their own dwellings and lodgings. The simplest Tudor buildings were one room, and families would share it with their animals, and the most extravagant were masonry buildings like Hampton Court. Brick, and especially fancy brickwork, was a signifier of wealth, along with chimneys. Chimneys were a huge signifier of wealth, and Hampton Court had 241 of them, all ornately carved. Detail that only the chimney sweeps would see. But it was all about the show of money. Henry VIII was telling everyone, hey, look at me. I'm so wealthy, I can spend money on these elaborate chimneys that literally no one's going to see, and I can afford to burn wood in each and every fireplace. Eventually, the cost of brick and masonry decreased, and during the Tudor era was adopted by the lower classes. And someone realized that if all of those lower houses had masonry fireplaces, it would be a lot safer than having open fires in the middle of the floor of a thatched roof house. If the thatch caught light, the whole house would burn down, and frequently take a few neighbors with it. In the towns, the houses were closely packed, and the houses across the street weren't safe from the spread. To maintain the wide streets, ground floors of each home were appropriately distanced, but each floor above was extended several feet out into the roadway than the floor below. So every single floor was a little farther out than the one below. These extensions were called jetties. They could just be for one room or for the entire front. And it is said if the homes were tall enough, you could shake hands with the occupants of the house across the street. In that kind of condition, you can absolutely see how fires would spread in cities. As Hull houses were only 2 stories, Tudor architecture, with the invention of the chimney, which could act as not only a structural element but also could heat upper floors, allowed for more floors to be built, and these homes could be 2, 3, or 4 stories. Another change from the medieval to the Tudor was the development of close or ornamental studding. In other words, the timbers between the wattle and daub, or plaster-like substance. The timbers were more closely spaced, quite substantially so, and or laid out in a fully ornamental design. Also during this time, you began to see some of the wattle and daub between the timbers get replaced with masonry as a signifier of a family's economic status. Also during the Tudor era, windows became more widespread, rather than the openings with vertical timber mullions we saw during the medieval era with the Hull House. These windows were leaded glass, made of small pieces of glass, and due to a window and glass tax, along with just the cost of the window, when people moved house, they apparently took their windows with them. Roofing material also began to change during this era. Where thatch had been fairly standard up until now, the development of clay roofing tiles became another option, which would further reduce fires in towns and cities. Unfortunately, it would not save London from the Great London Fire, which took place in the 1660s. Interiors of the Tudor home were not all that different from the Hull house. Interior partitions were still wood paneled, and the only difference was the level of ornamentation, which varied by class and economic status. The simplest of homes had flat wood walls, simple board doors, and unornamented stair rails and mantels. The wealthy, meanwhile, had ornate wall panels, ornate door frames, Tudor arch doors, an ornate fireplace mantel carved from either stone or wood, ornate stair rails. You get the idea. And of course, the Tudor arch became really iconic during this time, and it sort of looks like a flattened Gothic arch. All classes had flagstone floors, which were then covered in rushes, which is sort of like straw, just sort of meant to collect the stuff that gets trekked in, on the ground floor, and wood floors on all the floors above. Starting in the Tudor era and going into the Elizabethan, spaces also began to get divided by that central chimney by their separate uses, with on one side there now being a kitchen, and on the other side what we'd probably recognize as a sitting room or parlor. The rooms above would serve as bedrooms, and instead of one, like in the Hall House, there would be several, though the quality of the sleeping arrangements varied. There was usually only one good bed, and that was kept for the head of the house and his wife, unless, of course, guests were visiting. Eventually, the Tudor era of architecture came to an end, and surprisingly, during the reign of the last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, not after. The Italian Renaissance was already influencing architecture in England, but during Elizabeth I's reign, it truly took hold, developing what is frequently called Elizabethan style, but was really more part of the English Renaissance. But it wasn't the end of Tudor architecture. Like many other styles, it saw a revival. But that will have to wait until next week. So thanks for joining me today for Tudor architecture, a nice prequel for next week's video on its revival. Until then, you can find me on Instagram at Simming History and Sims 4 Gallery at Simming History, where there'll be playable versions of this and many other builds. Thank you to all the new subs. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. When we hit 1,000, I'll do a live build. So subscribe and share. I'll see you all next time. Until then, bye!